Well, here's Sharon and Geoff from the Isle of Wight Family History Society. I shall shut up and hand over to you. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much for having us. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. Okay, I will start. Geoff and I have been invited by your group to talk to you about family history. We're going to do a little bit of more detailed talk about how to add depth and detail to the lives of your ancestors. So it's a little bit up from the basic family tree presentation I believe you've already had. I am going to begin. I'll discuss the difference between family history and genealogy. And show you a couple of things that you might find on your family history journeys, the sorts of information you can find out and the record sets that are out there for you to use. And as Sally said, there will be a quick break where you can ask me some questions. And then Geoff will follow up with his presentation on researching military history of your ancestors. And he'll be having a look at those topics in a bit more detail. So, first of all, let's go over some common misconceptions there are about family history. I guarantee that you've all seen one of the programs that's either Who Do You Think You Are or Air Hunters or something similar. And they do make out that family history is really easy. You just type your ancestor's name and all this stuff magically appears. It doesn't quite work like that. Another common misconception is that we can all trace our ancestors back to William the Conqueror and people like that. To be honest, unless your ancestors were of extremely good breeding indeed, you're unlikely to be able to get much further back than the mid-1600s. That's where the records tend to sort of dry up. And the last one really is, once you've tracked back as far as you can, your family tree's finished. But a lot of people who say that have only done a genealogy, which is a pedigree. So a pedigree chart of names and dates does not a family tree make. So family history as a concept requires you to look at a lot of different subjects. And I know you're all associated with learning, hence the university that you're all with. So learning is not a thing that you're scared of. So when you're looking at family history, you're also looking at local history, at social history, at law, and at customs, traditions, different religions, all these sorts of things that affect people, as they do today, but you've got to put it into the context of your ancestors. So prepare yourself for a learning journey, really. Each and every one of us will experience something completely different as we go through our research. Whether your ancestor was a landowner or a labourer, a financier or a footman, there is a huge amount of information you can find, and they're all different types of sources depending on what presents itself. So I'm just going to give you some top tips. As with any type of research, be methodical. Think laterally, think logically, and progress as you would with any other subject. Always record your findings and your sources. As a self-taught family historian, I have made all the mistakes, which includes writing something really interesting down and then forgetting where I found it. So don't do that to yourself. Don't make presumptions about your ancestors either, but record any theories you might have. So something strange pops up, brainstorm some ideas, create scenarios. Why did your ancestor do X, Y, or Z instead of what you expected? And also find a good filing system that works for you, be it pen and paper, be it digital, or a combination of the two. Find a system that works for you, and then you'll always be able to find your information and go back to it. So lots of people do get confused with these two terms, and they get used and interchanged and all this, but they are two different entities. Genealogy is the establishment of a pedigree by extracting evidence from all valid sources of how one generation is connected to the next. So this is creating a pedigree chart. Imagine all the ones that you've seen for kings and queens of England and things like that. A family history is something extra. So it's an extension to genealogy, where you look at the lives and the times of the people concerned. Family history puts the leaves on the tree of your family tree, and it creates a biography of your ancestors' lives. So you're suddenly not just looking at names and dates, you're looking at life events and creating a picture of people. So for an example here, this is from my own family tree. This is an example of a pedigree. These charts can take lots of different shapes and forms, but the essence is the same. You have a key person, you have a parents, their parents, and so on. But it's only looking at the direct ancestors of one person on your tree. If we're doing family history, that chart turns into this. Now that includes the same amount of generations on the previous chart. There's my granny down at the bottom there with a picture of her in her wedding dress. But now we're including siblings. Simply because none of your ancestors existed in a bubble with just their parents. Their siblings would have been a huge part of their lives, early life and even later life too. Perhaps your direct ancestor and a cousin decided they were going to emigrate and set up in America. Maybe two sisters got married on the same day. Perhaps a great aunt left your ancestor money in a will. These people are difficult to identify if you don't already know who they are because you've looked at a whole family group. So when you're starting out family history, the first thing you think of is births, marriages, and death certificates. They're not a strange entity. We've all seen some, even if they're only just ours. And the key pieces of information you need for tracing your family history come from these documents. You can easily order copies of your ancestors' certificates, should you need to, from the General Register Office. And some of the big subscription sites offer some certificates to view online. For instance, this one from Warwickshire is my third great uncle, his second marriage. And I've put a little tip here because lots of people overlook the extra information. One key bit we often miss is who witnessed the marriage. And here on this certificate, John's sister was a witness with her husband, Herbert Wesley Halling. This was very useful to me because it narrowed down the timescale of when Susanna and Herbert emigrated to Canada, because I know they were still in the UK for John's wedding. So a key thing to do is to make sure you glean every single piece of possible information from the information that you can have. Another thing you'll know all about is the census. Now, the census was taken every 10 years and still is. You'll all just have filled one in recently. And they provide a really fascinating snapshot of family life. Admittedly, it was a one night only deal. We can't always presume that because mum was in the household with the son and his wife and the children, that she actually lived there. She might just have been visiting. But you do get a sense of what family life was like for your ancestors at the time. And another top tip I would give you if you're looking at census is have a look at the neighbours. The bottom image there is of my 4 times great aunt, her husband. And for some time, I couldn't find Mary's sister. And it just so happens that she's in the house next door. She's at the very top there, Gertrude. I couldn't find her for years and years and years, and she's living next door to Mary. So it's very important to look at your ancestors in a family group, but also their neighbours. These are the people that they interacted with on a day-to-day basis. Perhaps people they worked with, they went to the same church. You start to get a feeling for what life would have been like for them in a family setting. So what other things can we use to make your family tree something a bit more than just names and dates? We can look at the houses and neighbourhoods that they lived in, schools, further education, workplaces, and their occupation, what our ancestors left behind and how they were remembered, hobbies, pastimes, and the place in the local community, so organisations they might have belonged to, travel and emigration, and military service. Geoff's going to be talking to you about military history, but I'm going to give you a couple of examples on some of these other topics and things that you will find for your ancestors online. So maps and directories. I love looking at old maps. They're absolutely fascinating. And looking at where your ancestor lived on a map provides perspective. So it is always worth trying to find your ancestors' location on a map, be it a village, a town. You'll find their street. You might not necessarily find an exact house. The example I've given there is probably not a very good one because it's a very nice part of Ryde. So
it's an excellent example, Sharon. I used to live in one of those houses.
I know. But all the houses on the map are pretty much named, and the little directory snippet there, the houses are all named. So you can pinpoint exactly where these people lived. But should your ancestor be of a lower class, you won't necessarily find out exactly where they lived on a map, but you'll see the street. And you'll also see the local churches. You'll see the local pubs. They're often named on a good map. Farms are named, which is really good and really interesting, pinpointing exactly where your ancestor might have worked. Schools and education. It's quite tricky, really, to find out a lot of information about the early lives of your ancestors. But school logbooks are becoming increasingly available online. The one I've shown here is on Find My Past, but is also available at the County Record Office. And that would, I think, would be your first port of call. Go to your local record office and see what logbooks they might have. We were very lucky. There is a logbook for Honey Hill School in a private collection, which we've been allowed to transcribe, so members can see that on our website. It's also worth having a look, see if your young ancestor was apprenticed. You can see there that Thomas Foster was apprenticed. Oh, sorry, he was the master. Benjamin Meerman was the apprentice. And that's in 1805, and he went off to train to be a plumber. So these might give us an idea of what our younger ancestors were trying to do. And it'd be interesting to find out if Benjamin did become a good plumber. I haven't done that. Obviously, there are hundreds upon hundreds of different occupations your ancestors could have had. Sadly, there aren't very many employment records available. But there are specifics. So, for instance, the Institute of Civil Engineers, they kept very good records. And there's my ancestor, James Fulton Blackwood, his paperwork from the Institute of Civil Engineers. You might find that some big employers, the likes of Guinness and Bulmers, I know they're both alcohol related, but they're the two that come to mind, they still have records in their own personal archive. You would also find local record offices might have collections from businesses that have since gone out of business. And a lot of these things I think are still held in private archives, but it's always worth having a little hunt about and see what you can find. Obviously, if your ancestor was in building or planning or anything, as mine was down there, bottom left, they might have submitted plans to the local council for properties that they were building. And of course, if they had a trade or a shop, you might find them in the newspapers. What your ancestors leave behind. Okay, hopefully they've left some money. So wills and probates are a good place to have a look to see how they divided up their wealth when they passed away. And these are just two examples of things you might find. But obviously you have the huge subject of burials, where they were buried, funeral services, obituaries that may have appeared in the newspapers, memorials, funds that were set up in their name, a memorial bench, for instance. So you really do have to do some good investigating and find lots of different sources, and local history and social history will come in here to see what your ancestor left behind for everybody else, for a community, how they were remembered. One of my favorite things in the world to use for discovering more is the newspapers, be it the local press or maybe something more national. The amount of different articles you have in historic newspapers varies very much from what you get today. Maybe not so much with the local press, it's still about the same. But you can have, you know, obituaries, a write-up of when your ancestor had their funeral, who attended. There's births, marriages, and deaths announcements. They're also very valuable. You've got the good old advert showing off Mr. Beasley there with his music tuition. But there's loads more. You have adverts, obituaries, school examination results were often published, prize givings, sporting events. If your ancestor was involved in a local society or a committee or a club, reports of their events and meetings often featured in the newspaper. Also church services, church fairs, lots of information about different parishes and their parishioners. And of course, the darker side of reporting. So there are less desirable reasons your ancestor may have featured in the local press. Local petty sessions, county bench, and the assizes would all be reported in the local news. So if your ancestor happened to allow your cows to stray on the highway, or if it was something slightly more serious, they would all be written up in the paper. Or perhaps your ancestor was called as a witness in a particular case. Maybe your ancestor's property went up for sale. I found really detailed descriptions of houses in the newspaper because it was going up for auction. So that's another reason to have an explore. And the British Newspaper Archive is adding titles almost weekly. So the amount of local news and national news that is available online now is quite astonishing. And we've got travel and migration. I think we often forget just how transient people were in times gone past. The main reason that people would go anywhere is work. So if there was the opportunity for work overseas, they would go. So we have quite a detailed or quite a good source from several websites for passengers leaving the UK. And a majority of those would be leaving permanently. You also get people going on holiday, obviously, but it's very helpful if one branch of your family suddenly disappear and they've set up home somewhere else. So in one quick search, I found this marvelous picture, which was on a US passport application. And it's of Wallace William Rolfe and his wife and his daughter Marie, who is Isle of Wight born, emigrated to New York. His passenger list is up the top there in 1913. And in 1923, he wanted to come back to the UK to visit his Isle of Wight family and had to apply for a passport. And there's his photograph on his passport application. And you get a great deal of information on the ships that were used, the voyages, the type of experience they would have had traveling there, how long it took. There's a great source if your ancestor went to farther climes. And here's a small list of only a fraction of other things that you can be looking for. The 1939 register, obviously much more recent, but a fascinating source for anyone looking for family in that period. You've got criminal records, local archives, loads of stuff there. So really what I'm trying to put across to you is that finding out about your ancestors, it's not just about names and dates. It's very much about painting a picture of who they were as people. It was only recently that I came into possession of any of these photos that are displayed there. This is from one branch of my family. I'd never seen their faces before, but I've been researching them for about 11 years. I've already painted a really vivid picture in my mind of what they were like. I've discovered their joys and their heartbreaks, their day-to-day lives and their big moments, the standout moments in their lives. And by learning more about the records available online and exploring with local history, social history, and looking at the things that were going on in their lives globally, impacting them as people, I've seen why they made the decisions they made, why they chose the paths they took. I discovered the colourful career of a gentleman's secretary who went all around Europe with his job. I discovered about a young woman on the Paris fashion scene who later became a manageress of a clothing house. I've seen the chap with the impressive beard there. He was the first generation of builders in my family, and his building firm went down 3 generations and continued into the early 1900s. And I've learned about the tragedy of a mother who took her own life. And I never knew anything about them other than their names until I started embarking on family history. And that's the sort of thing you can get back. The return is amazing. But if a pedigree chart full of names and dates is enough for you, then dive into genealogy. That's what you need to be doing. But for me, it's family history all the way. Why would you not choose this avenue to explore? There is so much help out there, informative webcasts, podcasts, all sorts of stuff. And you have a marvellous family history society here on the island who are very willing to help. And you don't have to have Isle of Wight ancestors for us to give you a hand. So I hope I've inspired you even just a little bit. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was an amazing trip through. How much of that is actually online, those newspaper resources particularly?
All of the newspaper resources were taken from online sources. County Press has its own online archive, and the British Newspaper Library archive is where everything else came from.
It's extraordinary. Questions, Alison?
Yes, I wonder if, Sharon, you could tell everybody a little bit about the Isle of Wight Family History Society and how they can access the records and when you might be open next, things like that.
Okay. At the moment, obviously, our resource centre at Northwood Cemetery is closed. We are hoping to reopen soon, but we are still to have a committee meeting to finalise when that will be. We need to make sure that it's safe for everybody to appreciate and come and use our facilities. As a society, we do have some very unique record sets which are available to our members. As a resource centre, obviously, we offer us and our knowledge and experience and our help to help you on your journey. So you don't necessarily need to have Isle of Wight ancestors. The process is the same. We do monthly meetings. At the moment, we're doing them via Zoom. And members get a journal 4 times a year, which is very informative. We have a very active Facebook group, and we have a very shiny new website. So if you haven't been to see our website, go along. Free for everyone to use. There are various record sets, but the main ones are the Isle of Wight births, deaths and marriages indexes, which are slightly more enriched than what you will find on other sites online. Geoff, add something.
Yes, I can add something. We do actually intend, subject to whatever regulations are in force, to get the resource centre up and running again in mid-May. We do work very closely with the County Record Office at Hillside, and much of the information which we have got has been taken from transcriptions with their permission. So our relationship, if anybody doesn't know about the Record Office and the manager of that, Richard Smout, we have a very close and mutually helpful relationship with the people at the Record Office. So a lot of our information is derived from them, and we're helping them to make their information more accessible. But I'll say a little bit more at the end of my talk about what we do in membership and stuff like that, if anybody would like to become a member.
The other thing that you've got on your website is some fascinating PDFs of old books about the island, which I've been enjoying.
Yeah, the book list really is basically a list of links to publications which are in the public domain. So if you're aware of things like Google Books, for example, you can search for these. But what we had was somebody had actually done all the hard work of finding out where all these books were, and provided us with the links to them. So all that involved us doing was effectively copying all those PDFs and providing the links to them. But yeah, if you're interested in Isle of Wight history going back 200 years, not very much from a family history point of view, but from a topographical point of view is principally what these books are. But you can get diverted down all sorts of rabbit holes into, you know, the flora of the Isle of Wight and local traditions and the language of the island and all sorts of things like that.
Yeah. Okay, Diane?
On the avenue, Geoff and Sandra, there is, in Freshwater, there is a shop, and it names it's the island history as well. Is that something that you're affiliated with?
It's not. We're not affiliated with any other society. But one thing I was saying to Sally, and one thing that the society has always been keen on doing, is to amalgamate all the local history groups. There is an Isle of Wight history forum that exists on the island, and that sort of pulls all these groups together every so often for a meeting. But we have a very good relationship with other societies. We invite them to our conference every year. We have a yearly conference. This year, obviously, it won't be a physical one, but in the past it has been. And we love to have other societies bring along their stand and give us information about different topics that we're running on our conference. But no, we are not associated with them, but we are very friendly with a couple of the ladies who are involved. So
lovely, thank you.
Jackie, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'm interested in almost getting a bit of one-to-one help with some things. I was lucky enough to inherit a huge family chest full of all sorts of things. There's even an outline of, I think it was something to do with Nelson's supper with royalty and blah, blah, blah. There's all sorts of stuff in there. And I just can't understand a lot of it. But obviously it's quite delicate. I have to be careful about transporting it. Is that the sort of thing? I am a member, or I was a member of the Family History Society, but I never really got into it, and I should do.
One thing that we love to see people's original things. I mean, when the HRC is open, Geoff and I have been graced with photo albums and family Bibles and all sorts of stuff. Obviously, if it's something that's very, very delicate and very precious, we wouldn't want you carting it into into Northwood Cemetery and bring it to our home if it's not safe. One thing I would advise is to get some professional advice about making sure that you keep these things safe and precious, and keeping them wrapped in archive paper, for instance, and photograph them or scan them if you can. But yes, we'd love to have a conversation with you. We'd love to see your goodies. And when the HRC is open again, I'm sure Geoff and I will be able to help you with at least a portion of it.
Okay, yes. That's great. So things like a lot of postcards and calling cards and just these little family, death cards. And you've got no idea where the links are.
Yes.
A photograph of a lot of dead cows, which I did eventually find. It was on a farm in Godsill where the cows were hit by lightning.
Oh my goodness.
And I actually found the county press record, but there's all sorts of little things that it's hard to understand.
Oh, fabulous. A proper detective job. That's the sort of thing that gets me very excited. That's like Christmas.
Okay, any more questions for Sharon? Looks like not. Thank you very much, Sharon. That was great.
You're very welcome. I'm still on the call, but I'm going to turn my camera off momentarily.
Okay, I'll hand over to you, Geoff.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to be sharing my screen and presenting in a similar fashion to Sharon. So just let me pull up the presentation and get that going. That will take about a second. Okay. So as Sharon mentioned, my particular interest is military history. As Sharon's mentioned a number of times, you don't have to be an islander to join our society. I've got no connection from a family point of view to the Isle of Wight at all. The nearest I can claim is that somebody was born in the military hospital in Portsmouth. But nevertheless, the principles are the same. My connection with military history is that for a long time, I've been involved with the Imperial War Museum as a volunteer, doing things like researching individuals' family history in terms of the military sources, but also the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So I've visited countless numbers of cemeteries abroad and in the UK, and also war memorials. And that's really where I got started, is to try and identify the war memorials on the island, and from that do some work on identifying military history, and that then led on to all sorts of other sources of information. And as Sharon was saying earlier, that the context in which you do your family history is to try and find out as much about an individual and their families, how they worked, what they did. And I would imagine that virtually everybody on this call has got some ancestor or some relative who has served in the services at some point. So what I'm going to do is very quickly run through a large number of sources of information. But what you must remember with military records is that they were never ever created for family historians. They were created for particular purposes to do with the running of the military. So we can access army service records, campaign records. I've mentioned the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, so that if somebody died in service, they will have a record of where they are buried or commemorated. A spin-off from that was the War Graves Photographic Project, where a team of people went around the world photographing every single headstone for every single Commonwealth War Graves Commission burial, which is about 2 million. There are the regimental museums, and crossing over into the other services, Royal Navy service records, Air Force records. I'm also going to include the Merchant Marine, the Merchant Navy and the Mercantile Marine, because they were effectively operating in the wartime in the same area of operations as the Royal Navy. And I'll also be touching on the nursing services. And I might bring Sharon back into that because she's been doing an awful lot of work on the voluntary aid detachment. So what I'm showing you there on the right-hand side is part of the service record of just an ordinary soldier, happens to be my great-great-uncle. And I won't attempt to read all of that out to you, but basically what these records are pay, rations, discipline, promotions, records of service. In some cases, they do give family information, and I'll touch on that as we go through. So on the left-hand column there, you'll see the sort of things that records were kept for. Now, what the military are very good at is keeping records. You can imagine that somebody in the trenches in the First World War is fighting away, but behind the scenes, there are armies of clerks and adjutants recording what is actually happening, both at a regimental level and at an individual level. So all of that information is being kept and passed back to HQ and ultimately finding its way into repositories such as the National Archives, regimental museums, and so on. So what can you get out of that from a family history view? Well, you'll get all the information that you could possibly want in terms of names, ages, promotions, medals awarded, family details, medical history, which in some cases is rather gruesome, what training they received, and so on. Now, some of the difficulties that you'll find in accessing these records is that they are divided up in all sorts of ways which make it difficult for you perhaps to find what you want. And the final column there identifies that most records were held according to the rank. So an officer's set of records will be kept. Non-commissioned officers or petty officers will have a separate set of records. Other ranks and ratings will have another set of records. So although all of those sets of information will be around somewhere, you can't necessarily look at them all with one set of indexes. So let's look at the army first. And again, one of the classifications that you'll need to understand is when a person actually served in the military. And what I'm going to do is sort of divide it up into broad areas of time, looking first at the early 19th century and working through the Victorian period and through the major wars of the last century. What the picture there shows is a company of the Isle of Wight Rifles in 1909, which is a territorial force. Many people will know that the Isle of Wight Rifles was the regiment for the Isle of Wight. It was actually part of the Hampshire Regiment. And they were volunteers. So you'll find, if you have island military ancestry, that your ancestor is very likely to have served with the county regiment, whether it's the Hampshire Regiment or the Isle of Wight. But you'll find for the island that neighbouring counties also feature quite prominently. So Dorset Regiment, Hampshire, Sussex, Duke of Cornwall's light infantry for some reason seems to feature quite regularly in people's services. The first thing that we've got, and this is again a document which comes from the County Record Office, is a very rare survival of a list of militia volunteers, which was taken in Calbourne in 1803. And one of the things that you need to understand is why these things were drawn up in the first place. And it's very likely that this was drawn up because there was a threat from abroad. Probably the French, who are threatening to invade the Isle of Wight again. So these were volunteers who had arms. So in Calbourne Parish, the manor of Calbourne, the parish of Calbourne, which stretched quite a way. Sir John Barrington from Simeon, the Simeon family, is there at the top. His servants, and then all of the parishioners are named with their families. So this is an effective census of Calbourne Parish in 1803. Very unusual to find such a thing. That's available on our website. There are images of all of the pages of that, but also the originals are with the County Record Office. So that is, again, a very unusual thing. One thing to say about early records like this, particularly with the regular army and the Royal Navy, is that very few detailed records of ordinary soldiers and sailors were kept. Much of the information you'll find from early periods is of officers only. During the Victorian period, Victoria's 60-odd year reign, you probably know that the British Empire was engaged in policing actions throughout the world, often called Victoria's small wars. And many islanders, both officers and other ranks, served in the forces and travelled extensively through the world in those actions. And you'll find evidence of this in many of the churches on the island. This particular plaque is in Carisbrooke at St Mary's, which has got about 20 identifiable plaques like this of service. So this particular person, George Robertson, fought in the Coorg War of 1834. Who knows what that was, but nevertheless, he did die there, and he's commemorated on that rather nice plaque at St. Mary's. So if you are able to get out and about and start visiting churches again, do have a look up at the walls and at the windows and at the fonts and at the burials in the churchyards, because you will find a large number of mentions of people who served in the military. Crimean War, very famous obviously for being something which recognized the suffering of the soldiers and the sailors involved. Florence Nightingale obviously publicized a great deal what happened to the men who were serving, and very few of them actually died in action. Most of them died of disease. But it's also at this time that you'll start finding photographs of individuals. So the picture at the right is of a former Royal Marine who later retired to Bembridge, and we're fortunate to have seen a copy of this picture. Many of them were out pensioners of the Royal Hospitals at Chelsea for the Army or Greenwich in the Navy, and they identify the service that they give. But you'll also find that there are a large number of obituaries of Crimean veterans as they died off towards the end of the 19th century. The Hoy Monument was actually erected in commemoration of Tsar Alexander I, but there's also a plaque on the side which was erected later to commemorate the brave men of the Allied armies who fell on the Alma, Inkerman and Siege of Sevastopol in 1857. So it's rather strange that one monument should on one side commemorate the Russians, but on the other side actually commemorates the people who are fighting against the Russians. You can never get up, and it's a nice little walk along the down to the top of the down there to the Hoy Monument there. Skipping through quite a large number of Victorian wars now to the end of the 19th century, and another conflict which has become very well known, the South African Wars or the Boer Wars. It's at this time really that something odd happened with military service, because up till this point, most of the people who were serving were regular army or regular sailors, whether they were forced or not. But the South African Wars was the first series of campaigns where volunteers were involved in the process. The plaque that you can see there is for the Hampshire Militia and Isle of Wight Garrison Artillery. Now, these were volunteers. They weren't supposed to serve abroad. They were supposed to be defending their homeland. So they have been sent to South Africa, and several of them died there, again, mostly of disease. One of the people mentioned there was killed in action. But you'll find as you go around that there are a number of memorial plaques to the volunteers at Ryde, for example, the town hall in the niche there where the main World War I and II memorials are. There's a little plaque there. And the Newport plaque, which is now, I think, at Calbourne Watermill Museum, names literally hundreds of people who served there. So if you think that your ancestor was involved in the Boer Wars at all, then it's a good chance that if he was from the island, he's named in some manner. Okay, the World War I services. Now, what I'm using here is an example of somebody who served in both the South African War and World War I. Stanley Winter Cause from Metalstone. He was a bit of an action man, it would seem. He served in the Boer War with a voluntary unit, Paget's Horse, so a cavalry regiment. He went to Canada. He became a member of the League of Frontiersmen, so he was opening up the Canadian wilderness for farmers and hunters and so on. He came back to the UK with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces, and then transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, where he became a pilot. He was killed in action very soon afterwards. The life expectancy of pilots and observers in the First World War could be measured in days. The image there is from a publication called de Rouvigny's Roll of Honor. He's a French Marquis who decided at the beginning of the war that he would try to get biographies of every person who was killed during the First World War. Obviously, that was a rather large undertaking. He managed about 70,000, and he gave up after a couple of years. But nevertheless, even for some of the ordinary soldiers and sailors and airmen who fought in the war, who died, you may be able to find some information about them. So that picture is a rare picture of a serviceman from that particular period in a published work. World War I itself, massive subject, could spend many days and hours talking about it, but basically for the army, the records are held by the regiment or unit. Many of the service records were in a repository in London and were destroyed during the Blitz in the Second World War. But many of those records were rescued, waterlogged and burnt, and were preserved at the National Archives. So they do survive as burnt documents. Many of them, if pensions were payable, survive as well, because the pension records were kept for as long as the recipients of the pension were alive. So if you know that somebody, for example, died in service or was invalided out and received a pension, then it's possible that you may be able to find out more information about that. The pension cards, for example, 10 million pension record cards were rescued by the Western Front Association. They were just going to be dumped. So they have scanned them all and they are available. And they do provide a lot of information in terms of families, because if a man died and had children, the children's names and dates of birth are given on those cards. And that's a source of information that you would not necessarily think about looking at. Also, with medal index cards, virtually every person who served in the First World War was awarded at least one, probably two, and in some cases three, and if they were awarded gallantry medals. So all of the medal index cards are also preserved. If you want to know about what happened to people while they were fighting, the war diaries for each regiment are held by the National Archive, but these are extremely difficult to use. Probably written in pencil in the trenches by the adjutant, and they don't really go into detail of individuals other than to say that a number of officers died, a number of other ranks died in a particular action, but they are useful if you want to find out how your ancestors served. I've mentioned already the Imperial War Museum. They have two main sets of information: the lives of the First World War, which attempted to produce biographies of several million men and women. That ran out of funds, but that was operating on the 100th anniversary of the war. So that was in operation from 2014 to 2018. I was a volunteer on that. And there's another thing called A Street Near You, which I'll show you an image of shortly. And many people who had emigrated returned to serve in the First World War. So you'll find that Australian and Canadian archives in particular are really useful in finding out what happened to Anzacs and to the Canadian Expeditionary Forces and New Zealand, of course. Jumping to the Second World War, the main problem that a family historian here is that most of the records of all services are still held by the Ministry of Defence. They are released to next of kin for a fee. Takes a couple of months for you to get them, but you have to prove your relationship. So you have to have death certificates and a trail of proof that you are actually entitled to see those records. However, the local newspapers, and Sharon's mentioned this earlier, are a vast source of information. Every week, the papers would have at least one page of information on the island and the war. This is for both First World War and Second World War. And you'll find that there are occasionally photographs, none in the First World War. The county press didn't start using photographs until the 1930s. But nevertheless, there is masses of information about what happened to individuals. The county press can be searched by name. It is indexed, but the quality of the images in some cases is a bit iffy, so be careful with that. I've heard that the National Archives will eventually take over these service records, but there are literally millions of documents taking up miles of shelf space. Many individuals even now are still alive from the First World War, so they're closed. So it's going to take some time, but eventually, if you wait several years, then you may find that the World War II records become available. That was the Army very quickly. The Royal Navy, very similar sort of subjects, same sort of period, same sort of records. The thing about the Royal Navy is, though, that all of the records survive from the periods that were of interest, which is the Victorian period and the World War II. So a World War I typical service record from the Royal Navy gives the full service history of an individual. The Navy was organized by ship. The ship need not necessarily be a vessel, it could be a shore establishment. So you can get these documents from the National Archives, and during the COVID lockdown, you can actually get these for free. They're normally £3.50 a pop. But if you are interested and you want to get these records, get on now before the National Archives decides to stop the free service. So what this gives you basically is a history of an individual, shows his place of birth, his trade, his date of birth. The little block at the top has a description of the individual, and this is important because before photography, if a man deserted or was otherwise not a very nice person, it was often the case that they wanted to have his description, so height, color of eyes, distinguishing marks, so you'll find tattoos and scars given there as well, disciplinary history. This batch of records goes up to 1929, when the ledgers were replaced by a card-based system. From 1923 onwards, the records are held by the Ministry of Defence, as with the Army records. But you might find in some cases, unusually, you might find the cards as well, which can take you up to the end of their service, sometimes in the Second World War. So if a serviceman was a long service serving member of the Navy, you might find you get his full service history rather than the one which stops in 1929. You'll often find with these records as well that the very abrupt abbreviation DD, which means discharged dead. HMS Victory, you'll find, is used as an administrative center. So between ships, most people were then allocated to HMS Victory. So if you see HMS Victory or something like that on a record, don't think that the guy was actually in Portsmouth Harbour serving on board the ship as it was at the time. Jumping to World War II, then, as I said, the records are still held by the Ministry of Defence, but County Press, again, useful source. There's a report here I found of a sinking of a vessel, HMS Courageous, which had a little article about two of the sailors who were survivors from that. So there's a little section in the paper there which actually gives photographs of those individuals. It's always nice to get a photograph of your relative. The National Maritime Museum I'll also mention there if you want to be looking at vessels rather than individuals. So if you know a ship, you'll probably find that you'll find a picture of it somewhere in the National Maritime Museum. The Royal Naval Air Service and the Fleet Air Arm and the Royal Marines all considered to be part of the Navy. Essentially the same sort of thing, but because they're different branches, the information, again, is in slightly different places within the record sets. The plaque there is quite unusual. This was a naval pilot who was killed in the defense of Malta, but he actually is named on the Battle of Britain memorials in London and in Kent because he was serving at the time of the Battle of Britain and was involved in the defense of the UK at the time. So that's Alistair Kindersley, very ornate plaque at St. Michael's at Shoalfleet. Now, many of the naval pensioners went on to serve with the Coast Guard. Coast Guard are a funny organisation because you'll find that most of the people in the Coast Guard on the island were not islanders for a very good reason, so that they were looking for smugglers or various other people involved in nefarious activities. So they tried not to post people to their hometowns or villages. This picture here comes from an album that I had access to, which was a photograph album made by Alfred Dashwood, a solicitor of Ryde. A very nice picture of the group of Coast Guards at Totland in 1888. I looked at the 1891 census and I can probably name the officer on the left, but it's probably impossible to name any of the other men on that particular photograph. But it does give you an example of what you might be able to come across. The Air Force, again, created from the Army Royal Flying Corps and bundled together with the Royal Naval Air Service. Later on, you'll find other units such as the Royal Air Force Regiment and maintenance units. So don't forget that many of the people who served in the Air Force were not air crew. The picture there is actually my dad, who was a ground fitter, served in the Second World War in Belgium. But there's also associated groups like the Air Transport Auxiliary and the Women's Auxiliary Air Forces and the Nurse Services. So don't forget that those services encompassed all sorts of trades, not just flyers. So I've sort of repeated what I've said there, but you'll find that especially in World War I, when the RAF was formed on the 1st of April 1918, that many of the original Army records then became RAF records, and many of the Royal Naval Air Service records were duplicated as RAF records as well. So it might well be that if somebody in the Army transferred across and his Army record was lost, you might find his RFC record and therefore his Royal Air Force record as well. Again, if you want to find out what the people were doing at the time, there are lots and lots of squadron histories available and details of operations. Many books have been published, especially of the operations in First and Second World War. So again, you need to know the squadron or the unit that your person served with in order to find out what they actually did. I've mentioned the Air Transport Auxiliary. Some of you may know Mary Ellis, who was the commandant of Sandown Airport. She died a couple of years ago at the age of 101. She was a ferry pilot with the Air Transport Auxiliary. There was a civilian service, but effectively it was under military command. There is a headstone at New Church, sorry, of an ATA officer who died while ferrying aircraft around the country. And again, many of the obituaries you'll find in the county press will name the services of that sort of group. I'm coming towards the end now, but I'll just mention the nursing services, again, organised by Army, Navy, Air Force. But I have mentioned already the voluntary aid detachments. A project that we did 2 or 3 years ago was to try to identify all of the VADs, both men and women, mostly women, but there were some men as well who served with the VAD. The British Red Cross made available their record cards. So we extracted from those all of the individuals who were given Isle of Wight addresses and created a record of those. And many of those we created biographies for. So Sharon and her team of volunteers created a set of information which is available, which expands on the history of what those individuals did. And we're also now looking at the records of the 10 or so hospitals on the island which took patients in for casualties from the First World War. The people on the right of the screen there are St. John Ambulance Brigade men. I don't know who they are, nor whether they're islanders or not, but the man on the right of that picture is wearing Boer War medals. So he will have been a volunteer serving in the Boer War in an ambulance nursing capacity. Military tribunals are a massive source of information, not just for military purposes, but also for other purposes. During the First World War, once the regular army and the conscription process started, weekly military tribunals were held everywhere, including the island in numerous locations, on a weekly basis to assess whether or not men were eligible for service. And each person's record is generally given a paragraph in the county press. Most of them were looking to be exempted for economic reasons. They had a job that was essential to the war effort, or they had a dependent mother or father or some other person that needed the wages. A few, of course, were conscientious objectors. And I came across this one for this person called Willie Lelova Lake. He was a conscientious objector, and unfortunately, there seems to be some prejudice against him because the first line of his report says, of foreign appearance. He was actually Anglo-Indian. He didn't actually get conscripted, but he did serve in the Merchant Navy. And that's where the picture comes from. There's a series of identification cards which were created by the Board of Trade, which included photographs. So if you know that your guy served in the Merchant Marine or Merchant Navy in the 1920s and 30s onwards, it's possible that you can find images of them. So mentioning the Mercantile Marine, that memorial there is the Tower Hill Memorial in London. And everybody from the Merchant Navy in both wars who died is mentioned there. There's about 40 or 50 islanders named on there. So I've been there and photographed their names. So again, gives you some idea of what they did, what vessels they served on. You could then go away and try and find out how they died, what happened to the Melbourne Star when it was sunk in 1943, for example. Other sources, there's masses of sources of military history. If you go onto Wikipedia or any Google source, you'll find that thousands of sources of information. I mentioned this thing called A Street Near You. This was a spin-off from Lives of the First World War, where one of the Imperial War Museum employees himself created this website, which actually identifies by location or even to street address where individuals had come from, and he's created this geographical map with images of all of the people from Cowes, for example, who died or served in the First World War. So this is a massively interesting source of information to try and see where there were people, for example, from PALS battalions who all joined up at the same time. So if you zoom in on this one, which I can't do on this slide, but you'll find that all of these people in Cowes or East Cowes are all living next door to one another and probably all enlisted or volunteered at the same time. Okay, that sort of comes to the end of my military aspect, but as we've mentioned earlier, we do have a new website, which you can see the address of there. It's an ongoing process. We had it developed last year and it went live in November. But many of the sources of information and records that we hold are still on our old website. But there are links to and fro the new website. So there's lots of information that's available both publicly and to members only. So some of the information is restricted to those of you who have paid your dues. So what I'd like to do now is do the advertising. The other aspect that I'm involved with, this is my own personal website, which is Memorials and Monuments on the Isle of Wight. So if you've got any interest whatsoever in war memorials and indeed any sorts of memorials on the island, you'll find information about it, which I have gleaned and compiled over the years into that particular website. And finally, what does it cost to become a member? For Islanders, you can get an e-journal membership, so you don't get the printed copy of the journal, for just £6 a year. And the normal membership is £12 a year. We will be putting up the membership rates next year, but this is really only concerned with the cost of postage and printing, which is going up all the time. Those rates we've kept steady since 2013. Okay, right. Thank you very much for your attention. I've gone on a little bit longer than I thought I would, but that now finishes my presentation for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was, well, a whistle-stop tour. Left more questions dangling that I have to come back to with further thought. Are there anybody, is anybody quicker off the mark with their questions? Maggie, and then Alice.
Yeah, hi. I've got a very interesting book. It doesn't relate to the Isle of Wight, but I wondered if there's one similar. I'll just explain what it is. Some years ago, I moved to the smallest county called Rutland, where my grandfather came from, with an unusual name. I was walking past a war memorial and saw the name. So I thought, well, I've got to research this. This is obviously an ancestor killed in the First World War, 18 years old. I got a book which details every person every man in Rutland who was killed in the First World War.
Yep.
With a photograph and a little bit about what they did before they went and got killed, and when they went and where they died.
Yep.
Now, I wondered if it's called Rutland and the Great War. Is there any other type of book that was produced by a particular county which would be useful to Hampshire and the Isle of Wight? This book was written by somebody called George Phillips, started in 1919.
All right. You'll find that various organizations and counties did produce those sorts of biographies. In fact, lots of schools and organizations did produce books like that. In the last 20 years or so, many of the family history societies have been preparing similar types of things. And many of the family history societies have had dedicated people like me doing things like that, but not necessarily publishing them as books, because there's so much more to be found out about them. So for the Isle of Wight, I would say that the source of information is my website, Memorials on the Isle of Wight. But I've never got to the point where I could say I've ever finished and produced that as a printed volume. So yeah, pretty much all of the counties of England, of Great Britain, have done something similar to that. So you will find there are books like that, which you can obtain in various forms.
Okay, yeah, this one is interesting in that not only outlines the men who died, but also those who served.
Yeah, and that's effectively,
yeah,
effectively what I'm trying to do as well. But on the island, for example, I've got records of something like 20,000 individuals who served in the forces in both wars. Yeah. So you can imagine that that's not a trivial task to do.
No.
Yeah. You may find that smaller community groups have done such. A colleague of ours in the Family History Society did a similar book for her area of the island, which is Gurnard and Northwood. So they put together the, a biography of the men who served from there. But we're talking vast numbers. But yeah, Geoff's website is a great place to have a look for anything related to the island. But lots of people like to do a more manageable chunk, if you like. I've started doing one very small part of the Hampshire Regiment, and that's, yeah, it takes a long time. And as Geoff said, it's never finished. There's always more records or more sources that we find as we go along. So it's an ongoing task.
If anybody's got any information they'd like to share with us in terms of,
yes, please.
If you know something about your individual ancestor who served, or you've got photographs, we're happy to take copies of them.
Yeah. Okay. Just one quick
Maggie,
thing.
hang on a minute. Let me go to
Sorry,
Alison.
no, I'll let you go on. It's okay.
Alison, thank you.
Yes, Geoff, I've got a naval ancestor.
Yeah.
Whose records state that he was discharged at the outbreak of World War I And on his records, it says SNLR.
Service no longer required.
That's what I wondered. And then he went on to join the Merchant Navy.
Yeah, very often, yes. I mean, for whatever reason, he might have either done his 11 years or 19 years or whatever, or he's been a naughty boy.
Young. I think he's been a naughty boy.
And they've discharged them for whatever reason, but there's nothing to stop him then gone into the Merchant Navy and continuing in some other less arduous activity, or he may have been discharged for medical reasons, for example, or he wasn't.
I had wondered because, and what happened is that he was married, and then his wife remarried before he reappeared in 1918. He came back to this country with Spanish flu and promptly died.
Oh.
But he went to the home of his parents, and in the meantime, his wife had remarried.
Naughty boy.
It a bit odd. I find it odd. I can't find a reason for it. I'm just
well, that's what the abbreviation is. So,
service no longer required.
Yeah. But you might find that there is some disciplinary reason for that. If you've got his service record, that on the right-hand columns, it might have some detail of why that particular verdict was reached. But it sounds like he just wasn't efficient enough to be a sailor to the level that was required of him.
I think his wife probably gave him some grief. Thank you, Geoff.
Jackie.
Yeah, I think I probably do need to contact you, but I've got a curious question. My grandmother was a nurse. I think she was a sister at the St. Lawrence, what was tuberculosis hospital, but during the First World War she was nursing a lot of injured servicemen. And they used to write her poems, and I have a book of all these little poems that they wrote to her. But a lot of them, very few seem to be serving from the island. They were from the Bucks regiments and all over the place. So my question is, why were they on the island? And two, a lot of the people in there aren't of great interest to me. The book is obviously, but they must be of huge interest to some of the descendants of these servicemen that wrote in them.
Yes, well, you didn't have to come from the island to be treated in an island hospital. So the island hospitals, like all of the other VAD hospitals, which were created in the First World War, were basically just receiving the walking wounded. If you were well enough to come back to the UK, then you were assigned to a random hospital, which could have been on the island or anywhere in UK. So it didn't matter really. There's a whole raft of different regiments that you'll find who are being treated in those hospitals. If their wounds were bad enough, they probably would have been sent to Netley, the military hospital at Netley. The VAD hospitals were mainly of those people who were shell-shocked, who didn't have so much obviously wrong from a physical point of view, but perhaps needed less treatment than those who were seriously wounded. So you'll find that there are, and I mentioned earlier that there's a project that we're looking at the moment to identify the individuals who were treated in those hospitals. And each week in the county press, you'll find that Ryde Castle received 27 patients and discharged the 12 patients or whatever. So that sort of commonplace book where people have produced poems and so on like that is a very good source of information. And if you can track down the individuals, some of them might have given their service numbers, for example, then that's a very valuable and interesting source to have.
We have been given access to a like book, which Northwood House actually purchased in an auction. Northwood House in Cowes itself being a VAD hospital during World War I. One of the nurses who the book belonged to, we tracked her down. She is in our VAD nurses project that we did. And a lot of the soldiers who wrote in her book and drew pictures and all sorts of stuff are not islanders. The norm seemed to be you would not be sent to convalesce in your home ground. simply because it gave the soldiers an excuse not to go back when they became better. So you very rarely find anybody from an Isle of Wight regiment or of the Isle of Wight convalescing here on the island. But as Geoff said, they were these soldiers were often named in these newspaper reports. So if you happen to have somebody who enlisted in the, I don't know, Duke of Cornwall's or something, they could have convalesced here and we could well have a record of their name. But the norm was you wouldn't have islanders here. The best thing to do is to digitize your book, take some good photographs of it, and publicize it. You know, we might be able to help you track some of these soldiers, as Geoff said. If they've got an individual name or if they've got a service number in there, we'd probably be able to work out who they actually were. But very exciting, and those books are fascinating, such a treasure to have.
Joan and then Jim. You need to unmute, Joan.
Is that it?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good. Thank you. It's a question for Geoff, if I may.
Hello.
I recently found out that my father joined the Royal Flying Corps. I got this from the Imperial War Museum in February 1918 at the age of just 18. But I have no more information about his record or where that would be kept. Would that have gone to the RAF then, do you think?
Yes, if he served beyond the 1st of April 1918, if he managed to survive the war, then he would have had an RAF record. So it's very likely that you'll find an RFC or Royal Air Force record for the 1918 period, but it may well have been that that record was bundled together with his later service records and would be with the Ministry of Defence. But what I would suggest immediately is that you have a look at the website that I mentioned earlier, which was Lives of the First World War, to see if he has got a record there, and that might give you a few more clues as to his service number or so on.
Thank you. All I know is that he joined the Royal Flying Corps. I know no more information than that at all. But Lives of the First World War, is that correct?
That's it, yeah.
Website, the Lives of the First World War. Thank you very much, Geoff.
Okay.
Jim.
Yes, thanks very much, both our speakers, Sharon and Geoff. This is a question, or comment plus question to Geoff, really. He mentioned the Coorg War of 1834. I've actually been there.
All right, good.
It's now a holiday destination. You can go and stay in the coffee estates, Coorg Coffee Estates, great place. Anybody can manage it, near the city of Mangalore. Anyway, that then prompted me to think about, I mean, obviously I realized that people died in these wars, and of course they were not necessarily, the bodies were not necessarily brought home. Yeah. So having also visited Calcutta on another occasion, I went to the cemetery there, which is chock full of British dead, obviously mostly civilians, but also some military. But I was wondering, there are directories of the war dead from the First and Second Wars and other more recent wars. And of course, there are ways to find out. I think there's a cemetery index, which isn't very complete, but you can also find civilian deaths within Britain. Yeah. But when it comes to British foreign dead, or anybody you want to follow, whatever their nationality, I'm just wondering if you're aware of any central register or registers, partial or otherwise, where you could then look people up.
Yeah, so there's two things that come to mind immediately. There would be records of consular deaths, births and marriages, which are available within the normal series from the General Register Office. So if anybody who was in consular service, who was a British national, who was born, married or died in the Indian subcontinent, there should be a note of it somewhere in the indexes. My own great grandmother was born in India to a army sergeant. So there is a record of her birth in the GRO series as consular births. So you should be able to find something there about deaths as well. There's also a society called the Families in British India Society, which is doing an awful lot of research on families in India. And I suspect that they will be doing things like cemeteries and other records which are involved with the administration of India by British nationals as well. So have a look at them, FIBIS, you'll probably find them under. I might just give a general advert for this weekend. The Federation of Family History Societies are running a virtual seminar, costs £10, but nearly all of the family history societies and organisations in the UK are being involved in that. We've got a presence as well. So if you're interested and you don't mind forking out £10, have a look at that. It's called the Federation of Family History Societies, or Family History Federation. Really useful show. You find a link to it on our website. We'll be there virtually, and a number of speakers, very interesting speakers, 25 speakers lined up with recorded speeches and talks on all sorts of subjects. So if anybody's got any further interest in that, have a look. But going back to your Indian question, I would look at FIBIS to begin with. There's also lots of records from the British East India Company, which have been digitized over the years as well. So they'll probably be lurking around in the subscription websites somewhere.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Has Geoff disappeared or just offline?
I'm still here.
You're still there. Great. Okay, so any more questions? Or does it fall to me to thank you, Geoff and Sharon, very much for a very, very entertaining afternoon.
You're welcome.
And lots of nourishment for further curiosity.
Yeah, so you'll always get thrown down a lot of rabbit holes when you start doing family history. And I hope that we've just, you know, tempted you to follow down those holes a bit.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Thank you.